Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We are very pleased to welcome you today for an exciting discussion on the myth of the fourth industrial revolution, which is organized by the Lexham Chair and the Cyberjustice Laboratory. This cycle gives the floor to multidisciplinary researchers in order to raise awareness of how technological knowledge and artifacts are made and deployed to give legal professionals a better grasp of current normative challenges. We are in particular trying to deconstruct the idea that, for example, the internet, platforms, or the work automation, which is today's subject, and other offspring of the digital economy constitute a historical fatality and as such cannot be regulated. So to examine this issue today and live with Berlin, we are very honored to welcome Philipp Staab, who is a professor of sociology of the future of work at the Einstein Center Digital Future, and also Florian Butollo, who is a senior advisor at the Study Commission on Artificial Intelligence, Social Responsibility and Economic Potential at the German Parliament. And he also joined the Weissenbaum Institute for the Network Society. So without further ado, I give you the floor. And again, thank you very much for your participation.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. We're very curious and excited to present in this context, and it seems to be a good fit because our contribution is based on an intervention we wrote for Le Monde Diplomatique, which precisely deals with deconstructing the narratives around automation and the new industrial revolution, while pointing to changes that we consider to be more fundamental. So of course, there's a technical reality behind the discussions about automation and the fourth industrial revolution and so on, in terms of datafication of society and the economy, the interconnection in various ways, the Internet of Things, and also the growing capabilities of automation technologies. But it's also narrative that is very present in society, a narrative about substitution of work, and a narrative about new productivity potentials that might lead to a new era of growth. And these narratives are very dominant in the public sphere, but they also are underlying the political strategy making on various levels. And also academically, they're quite uncritically accepted. And in our view, this constitutes a misreading of the digital transformation because it focuses mostly on process innovation, i.e. rises in productivity in industry. And there are various expectations connected to this, but also fears about takeover of the robots, creating further inequality. And in our view, this accounts to a depoliticization of the problem, as if technology as such and by itself would be the reason for growing inequalities. And it also is a misreading because it might not consider what is more fundamental in terms of the changes in the economy, i.e. the platformization of the economy, developments that we frame as digital capitalism. And that was a good way or a good opportunity, this article in Le Monde Diplomatique, to combine our expertise, me primarily as an industrial sociologist, Philipp as a sociologist who focuses very much on the political economy of digitalization, of digital capitalism, in order to deconstruct, but also to offer another reading. And we will present this in very broad lines according to the following points. Now, I need the next slide, please. First of all, I will talk shortly about Industry 4.0, the narratives behind it and the social technical realities, and offer an alternative view emphasizing the social embeddedness of technological change, but also the limitation of what is called Industry 4.0. Philipp will then continue to give an outline of his reasoning about digital capitalism framed as privatized mercantilism, and in the concluding section discuss the European answer to these phenomena, which might be framed as counter-hegemonical neoliberalism. Okay, starting off with the narratives around Industry 4.0. I'm sure you know this, this stage theory presented in various graphics about a fourth industrial revolution, which is usually combined with a certain narrative that focuses very much on a growing ability of flexibilization with, at the same time, rising productivity and automation. The narrative says more or less that in future we will have customized production, individualized products that will be produced at the same productivity rates as classical standardized mass production, combined with a high degree of automation. There's a lot that needs to be commented from an academic or for scientific perspective. I will emphasize 3 points. First of all, this is a very selective reading of the digital transformation. You can say a very German approach to what digitalization means to the economy, meaning that it is manufacturing centered. So manufacturing industries are at the heart of it and not maybe media enterprises or tech companies. There's a high emphasis on process innovation, and it is also a very engineering heavy paradigm of the digital transformation, emphasizing very complex production technologies, investments in high technology, and so on. It neglects the variety of approaches that can be chosen in terms of manufacturing in different sectors, in different industries, but also in the economy as a whole. And it represents a teleological view of technological change, i.e., well, a quite defined narrative and picture of how the economy will work in the future that focuses on the strength, if you want, of the status quo industrial production models in Germany. Secondly, it's a stage theory that first of all assumes that all sectors will follow a path more or less simultaneously. The transformation will take on a very similar shape according to this narrative. And it also ignores path dependencies and continuities with former models of industrial organization. Curiously, the development that might be considered a revolution in the past 20 years, lean production, is not present in this technocentric perspective, which means that there is no understanding of how new technologies are integrated into existing production models. Thirdly, of course, it is a technocentric view, neglecting the social construction of technology and the various social processes around the implementation of technology, which means management orientations and styles, the availability of resources, and also conflicts around technology that shape the way that these new technologies are introduced. An alternative view on the next slide. Thank you. Emphasizes the embeddedness of Industry 4.0 into given production models, given institutional settings. First of all, we depart from a notion of varieties of digital capitalism. If Industry 4.0 represents the very German strand of digitalization, in the US, of course, you have a very different discussion focusing on the platformization of the economy and the role of tech companies. In China, you have different approaches, experimental approaches, and we need to understand how digital technologies operate under different institutional circumstances. Secondly, it's important to acknowledge the multifunctionality of Industry 4.0 technologies. Actually, it's not some set or some ready-made recipe for changing industries, but it is a bundle of different technologies, including 3D printing, advanced automation, digital assistance system, and so on and so forth, that are introduced by companies according to their needs, according to what fits, which implies that certain technologies can have a sweeping effect if they fit in a certain sector, but it also implies that we have very different trajectory in different contexts. The third observation is that we deal with a path-dependent transformation. The question is how new technologies are introduced into existing production models, which means in many industry, if we focus on manufacturing, the question on how they relate to given lean production approaches. And curiously, we have very similar rationalization objectives in lean production, i.e. the increase of flexibilization, the rise of productivity through networking the different stages of production. And if you want, this is taken a step further by certain Industry 4.0 approaches. But it also means that it can be completely different when we look at the processing industry, like the chemical industry or pharmaceutical industry. We will have a very different picture here. The fourth contextualization is the economic context. Very roughly speaking, we can say that there's structural overaccumulation. The problem of the economy, excuse me to be blunt here, is not that we have a lack of productivity, but there's a lack of effective demand, which means that that investment in productivity enhancing technologies might just not reap the economic effects that are envisaged because there is no sufficient demand for it. The empirical balance sheet 10 years after Industry 4.0 was proclaimed accordingly emphasizes the incremental character of the transformation, i.e. Companies are experimenting with certain aspects and certain single technologies out of this broad bundle of options, but it is a trial and error process much more than a full-scale revolution. And in terms of the effects, often we see an amplification of trends that were there before, flexibilization, also precarization in certain forms, and so on and so forth. So we have the situation that these technologies are embedded in what we already have, and the discourse on Industry 4.0 and robotics is very much neglecting these continuities. But why is this the case? What's the problem with the view that technology comes in and changes the thing? A pragmaticist view emphasizes certain contradictions and frictions, which I will explain with a very short reference to some company examples. First of all, there is what we call in research the problem of ambidexterity. That means that companies want to reap radical innovation while they still need to earn money from their daily business. We could see this at a prominent automation company that was experimenting with, or that is experimenting with advanced forms of modular production that could be a leap beyond automation technologies as we know it. But we also could see that these companies are forced to find ways to put partial informations to the market and experience a very strong contradiction and tension between the effort to go beyond existing approaches and the reality of earning money with step-by-step approaches and pragmatic ways of augmentation. Secondly, there is the implementation problem. Frictions concerning return on investment that are usually out of the debate about new technologies because the debate is technology focused. The question of how much investment is needed and what the actual returns are is often not acknowledged. And here we see well, a variety of efforts or let me put it differently. In the field, what you hear when you talk to companies is the general conviction that it's not enough to collect data and implement gadgets on the shop floor, but you need to have a concrete picture of how this actually will increase returns. At this level, it is often an uphill battle because the costs of equipment and social innovation meaning retraining of workers, reorganization of the work process and so on, tend to be underestimated. A good case in point is Adidas with their Speed Factory, the effort to establish a highly automated or fully automated factory for sneakers in the US and in Germany, an experiment which at the end failed because, first of all, full automation didn't work. So the company was urgently looking for sewers in order to fulfill certain not to be automated steps in the production process. And secondly, the end product was not competitive in terms of prices, was being sold for about 300 euros, or production cost of about 300 euros in Germany. Thirdly, often you have the situation that there might be over-engineering involved, meaning you have too complicated automation technologies that might fulfill their task but be not competitive or not cost efficient, but also in the sense that you might produce fancy and more sophisticated products, but you fail to meet the market demand. There was a producer of industrial pumps in Germany that experienced it in the following way, that they automated completely according to the Industry 4.0 narrative, flexibilized their production, offered pumps, which is supply parts in various shapes and colors according to the customer's needs, but only to find out that the customers are not prepared to pay more for such products, even though they are able to produce them in a more efficient way. All of that does not mean that technological change is not happening, obviously. Also, we need to keep in mind that industrial revolutions do not happen overnight. But it's important to acknowledge the frictions and the contradictions in this process to get a more realistic picture, which is not the one of sweeping industrial revolutions or sweeping substitution of work that is present in public discourse. Philipp, now it's your part.
Yeah, so yeah, I'll take it from here for the second half of our presentation. And well, just to say it again, and to recap a little of what Florian was saying, why did we talk about Industry 4.0 now? Well, first of all, if the robo-apocalypse, if the full automation of work should have happened anywhere in the last 10 years, it should probably have been Germany, right? Being sort of the last highly industrialized, post-industrial countries in the world. But what we see instead is that after 10 years of Industry 4.0, we have a removal of lighthouse projects. We have mitigated prognoses when it comes to technological unemployment, which is just not seen as a big issue anymore. And we have the frictions that that Florian was describing. On the other hand, of course, you cannot deny that with what we coin as digital capitalism, something is happening within the economy which is changing the equation of power, right? And what I and Florian as well in certain aspects of his work frames this dynamic as is the rise of proprietary markets, which is another term for, or I'd argue a more precise term of what many people mean when they talk about the platform economy. So no one can deny that ICT, information communication technologies, have become the central field of growth and of conflict in contemporary capitalism. We do problematize for good reasons, especially the concentration of power with leading companies being attached to that dynamic, meaning especially, of course, the behemoths of the commercial internet, such if we talk about the Western Hemisphere, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, to a lesser extent, Microsoft. And what those companies stand for from an analytical, social science, political economy type of theory building approach is a systemic transformation of accumulation patterns. If you do not deal with this term on a regular basis, what I mean by it basically is that they develop new ways, sort of style defining ways of how to actually make money in a more and more digital type of capitalism. Okay, so now this is stuck, but now it runs again. In my own work, I have this little ad block because this, like the translation of my latest book, which is termed Digital Capitalism, is actually in the pipeline. I sometimes use a quote from Schumpeter's Monopoly book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, to describe the way the theory that or the stuff I'll say on the next 2-3 slides is actually to be understood as. And that quote you can see here, which is: the best way of getting a vivid and realistic idea of the industrial strategy is indeed to visualize the behavior of new corporations or other industrial entities that introduce new commodities or processes or reorganize a part of the whole of an industry, which is, so the argument goes, exactly what those companies are doing or have done already, offering a specific promise to investors, which is that they actually embody a specific pattern of accumulation made for sort of the stagnating type of political economy or capitalism that Florian already mentioned when he was talking about structural overaccumulation. So what does the commercial internet, what does the part of the economy that is already run by Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon actually look like? Basically, when you look at the commercial internet, it looks like a system of privatized markets or proprietary markets, as I coin them. What does it mean? Well, you think about particular platforms, say an e-commerce platform, say app stores, but also say like Uber or whatever. And what you see is that they which is sort of a basic, highly established frame for platforms, that they are the same as markets. Usually you talk about marketplaces, right, first. And what those marketplaces do from a sort of value capture type of perspective is they subsidize consumption in order to gain market power, meaning, or exemplified by the fact that your Gmail account is for free, your Google Maps application is for free, your Uber ride is much cheaper than it should be if Uber was supposed to make money, and so on. While once they do actually work and they do actually make money, they do this by extracting value, not from the consumer side of the markets, which they are themselves, but from the producer side of these markets. A famous example, of course, being the 30% cut Apple and Google take for any transaction that runs through their respective app stores. It's a very interesting situation because the so-called Apple tax is being problematized within courts in Europe especially. But what you really see when you look, and I did that for a couple of years now, when you look systematically at those type of economies, you really see that 30% cut taken from all the value flowing through a market by the market-like company, by the platform, is sort of a rule of thumb. If you look at places that are less, that are not as much in the eye of the public, that are not sort of observed as much. And so you see that for example, I had someone who did a study on online, on markets for online pornography for me. And what she found out was basically that if you look at that type of that part of the commercial internet, what you see is that the Google-like companies in that situation, being MindGeek, they take a cut of roughly 90% of the money flowing through their systems. So you really see how this is sort of a system that that is there to capture value. And it's also a system that you have to describe when you look at its development as one that sort of developed from product-specific marketplaces, such as Uber, who deals in taxi rides, you know, to like real proprietary markets. When you think about the big four of the commercial internet, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon, or their counterparts in China, such as Tencent, Alibaba, or in Russia, sort of the only semi-autonomous periphery of digital capitalism with, for example, Yandex or Mail.ru. Those companies, they are not only platforms, they are meta platforms on which the other platforms actually depend in order to gain market access. There is no Uber on your smartphone if Google via Android or Apple via iOS, for example, does not grant it entry into that market. Those are really catch-all markets, which gather the whole of the supply, which is traded within the commercial internet, and which also capture, if you think about the operation systems of the mobile internet, iOS and Android, which also capture all the demand, because they do have the exclusive access to consumers who consume via those channels. So what I describe this system as is, I call it privatized mercantilism. This is what I call this pattern of accumulation, by which those companies do actually not, as Florian said, which is sort of the fiction of the industrial internet, they do not create, they do not enhance productivity. What they are basically dealing with is the extraction of rents from trade and infrastructure monopolies they have established. And I call this mercantilism because mercantilism was, just as in a way our present form of capitalism is, a no growth economy. And it was a world where you could only make a profit if you sort of cheated other parties. And the way that was usually done was by establishing trade monopolies. And those companies, they are sort of the trade monopolies of our times. But of course, mercantilism was also a system that was put in place by political agents in Europe, autocratic, feudal lords in Europe. And the trading companies of that time were there to enhance the political power that granted them those trading monopolies. While today we're dealing with really a privatized form of that type of mercantilism, where states, if you just think about the obvious issue, taxes, do not really profit from the practices those companies have established. They do run those value extracting systems by safeguarding their market function through particular control strategies that I'll quickly outline here. One, of course, is information or data control. This is what you might be familiar with if you are familiar with the work of Shoshana Zuboff, what she calls surveillance. If you look at it from a political economy type of perspective, like I do, it's what you could call, or what you can call surveillance, is basically the practice of gathering informations of demand and supply sides of the markets which those companies run, or with which they are actually similar, right? They are the same thing. And this is there to shape the processes by which those markets function. For example, via forms of access control, meaning that those that say Amazon or Apple decide who can be present on the e-commerce platform, or within the App Store if you're a software developer. They control prices on their platforms by controlling the field of competition, which is established on that platform by all those things that are currently being problematized in certain court cases, like where in a list of offerings do you put your own service, and where do you put the competing service, and that type of stuff are strategies of price control, basically. And they also use strong types of performance control, which is, again, this is an argument which is rather sort of comprehensively and theoretical when it comes to my intention. Meaning that if you think about performance control, you can think about, you know, an Uber driver using an app which tells him or her exactly what to do at what point in time, where to be, and so on, or a food delivery worker within the gig economy. But you can also think about a software developer in Kenya, the Philippines, or Germany, who also has to exactly go by the rules of performance, which say Apple or Google put in place when it comes to app stores. And then, of course, I think it is important to keep in mind that those companies, being really the poster childs of digital capitalism, they sort of work as a role model for the way other industries where they might not have such a heavy influence yet, even though they might try to get it, if you think at public services, for example, or also industrial production. Even if they do not have such a strong stance in certain places yet, they are seen as the blueprint by which those areas of the economy try to remodel themselves, which is actually something you can see in the industrial sector in Germany, right? What you do not see is the robot apocalypse or the automation apocalypse. But what you do see is, for example, Volkswagen cooperating on a cloud business with Amazon Web Services, or BMW building their own industrial cloud together with Microsoft. Those sort of cooperations are there, and it remains to be seen to which degree they might sort of take the model I described and try to implement it within industry. So this is where actually I would say sort of important things are happening, and they might happen sort of beneath the radar of the classical scientific observation of these fields, which are also, as Florian said, very much focused on labor process innovation and that sort of stuff. If you think that through, you could probably ask yourself if the system those companies have established, which, as I would argue, serves as a blueprint for the wider transformation of the economy, means something like the end of neoliberal capitalism. Why? Well, of course, you all know that markets, in a very particular understanding, are at the heart of any type of theory about liberal or neoliberal types of capitalism. The idea there being that markets are legitimized by several factors, and this now is not an exclusive list but rather a list of sort of very important aspects which sort of run through most liberal or neoclassical types of economic theory, which is, for example, first point, that trade on markets is actually a source of wealth, which might be true under certain circumstances. It might not be. That's not the point here. The point is that if trade is a source of wealth, then and this is what a liberal or neoliberal economy would be supposed to look like, then the system of proprietary markets that has come to rise within the commercial internet and beyond is actually something very different. It's a system where proprietary markets or where markets are privatized and they are used to extract rents, right? This is a very different type of thing. Another aspect is that you have markets in economic theory basically because things are scarce and you have to distribute them efficiently, right? That's why you need markets to establish prices, because not everybody can have everything because things are scarce. But then again, if you look at the markets those companies have privatized, it's in many cases it's markets of really ontological superabundance, right? If you think about digital goods such as MP3 or videos on YouTube, that sort of stuff, ebooks, those are things that can be copied by a keystroke. Like there are not really any significant costs involved, but every product makes has the same price anyway, and this price is not connected to the fact that those things are actually scarce. As a matter of fact, I would argue that proprietary markets are there to create artificial scarcity in an economy where certain goods are actually super abundant. Then there is an angle from which you could look at the situation, which is more on the political theory side of economic theories. If you look, for example, at sort of writings of Popper or Hayek as well, where markets are actually not only seen as good for innovation and that type of stuff that you hear right and left in business sciences, business studies, and so on. But that markets are actually also instruments for the diffusion of power, right? This is the whole argument against sort of a monopoly capitalism being laying out the ground for well, totalitarian political systems, fascism, and so on. And what you see in the system of proprietary markets that I described is that technology is actually nowadays used as an instrument for the concentration of power based on artificial scarcity, as I just said. Bottom line, the prerequisite for any liberal theory of markets is that markets need to be neutral. Everyone can participate. You have what is called in business studies the level playing field, right? Which is just basically the opposite of what the privatization of the market function those companies have established actually means. But, and this is now the last part of our presentation, we thought it would be a good idea to give you sort of a quick look at how we perceive the situation in Europe concerning European technopolitics. Because to end where I was just 10 seconds ago would mean to neglect the fact that there is actually conflict around this stuff everywhere, right? It's not like 5 or 7 years ago where no one was criticizing that these sort of practices. It has become mostly a commonplace thing to at least criticize big tech. And this has also sort of tipped off different strategies within Europe or some of its member states, Germany probably being the most influential of them when it comes to certain of those policies. One, of course, being the fact that that sort of European policymakers in recent years have been coping or have tried to establish something like a framework of digital rights. The most prominent example, of course, being GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. But there is also a strong attempt at reformulating what industrial politics or industrial policies can actually mean for a digital age. We have a lot of debate and actually some, if you think about the European projects of common interest, that's not the right term, but I think you know what I mean. Sort of the Airbus models in Europe. And there are quite a few initiatives that are coming up right now. One initiative coming from Germany is, for example, Gaia X, which is sort of a framework. It's supposed to be a European cloud infrastructure governance system. I'll say a few more words about that in a minute. Basically what it is an approach of market design within the cloud field. Then, of course, you have the situation. You have things which you could frame as Europe trying to take its own stance within what has come to be called as digital geopolitics. For example, we do have a strong debate, and we actually like their debate. There is right now the consultations about which type of money should be applied and so on are going on. About reconstructing a European semiconductor industry, which semiconductors are basically one of the main components within the geopolitical conflicts between the US and China. And you have, of course, most importantly and probably most influential, several strategies of political market design. Why do I emphasize that? I emphasize that because digital capitalism, the way I described it, is a system of privatized market design. While neoliberalism has granted the state always two roles, right? Make sure there's peace in the streets so business can go on, and design markets where they fail. So political market design is actually something that that the EU has been strong at. Whether you think it's a good or a bad thing doesn't matter here for the point in time. But the Digital Services Package containing the Digital Service Act and Digital Markets Act, which is also in consultation right now, they are attempts at a rather radical type of market design, and it remains to be seen what comes out of that in the end. The common denominator, if you look at the political discourse, the public and political debate within Europe, is the term digital sovereignty. This is sort of where all those different approaches to the digital economy or to digital capitalism come together. And to get to the end, I thought it would be good to give you sort of our or my, I think it's Flo's perception probably as well, correct me later if I'm wrong, about whose sovereignty is actually meant when you look at those policies and the way they are currently being executed in Europe. So what you see is that if you look at the line of rights, right, of establishing civic rights for the digital age, what you see is that there's a high emphasis on consumers, but there's very little emphasis on workers. The GDPR is, when it is being applied, it is applied for consumers. It is or companies and the way they treat consumer data, but it is not applied on workers, where all the types of performance control that I exemplified with Uber, the gig economy, algorithmic management, and so on, are actually being applied. When you think about the new industrial politics like Gaia X, like this cloud infrastructure initiative from Germany, if you're interested in that, we can also dig a little deeper in the discussion on that. What you see is that initially it was the Ministry of Economics which started this initiative. It put a few millions in the pot. It gathered all the agents from the industry, including Amazon and Microsoft, which Amazon at least was in every working group establishing Gaia X. So that's already sort of a weird thing. But and what it did then, once this discourse was established, was basically backing off and leaving the initiative to a consortium of private companies, which brings me to the next point, because it also exemplifies the way the private is overemphasized about the public within the question of digital infrastructures. You can see it in the Gaia X example. You can see it on a city level in Berlin or other European cities where mobility as a service platforms, for example, such as Google Maps or public competitors come up, and they always run as public-private partnerships where the power balance or the power imbalance between the private and the public agents is rather high, and of course tending towards the private suppliers. Then of course, more generally speaking, the situation is one where political and economic elites in decision-making outweigh democratic governance, with most of the stuff actually happening at the EU level. That's basically already a given. Also, you see that underlaying all those strategies is a basic understanding of that what we want to do in Europe, or at least what policymakers think is doable, is market design, which always outweighs any approach towards sort of, well, decommodification, which could be an alternative. And if you look at that framework that I tried to lay out here, you can wonder if you're actually dealing, when it comes to European technopolitics, with something like counter-hegemonical neoliberalism. Counter-hegemonical, as it tries to deal with the rising tech stars, especially from the US, partly also from China, but it doesn't take really much of a step beyond the market design and regulation framework that is well, that has been established in Europe for quite a while. So bottom line of what we said being probably that it's the market stupid and not the robots. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very interesting double conference, and so I will maybe let the public ask some question within the chat, and I see that maybe Karim, the director of the lab, would like to say a few words. So Karim,
yes, vous m'entendez là? Tu m'entends? Ouais. Oui. Thank you very much, Philipp and Florian, for this very interesting presentation. I've read your paper in Le Monde Diplomatique last year, I think, or something like that. And also your presentation reminds me now of the book from Cédric Durand. There is a recouping of quite a few themes. Cédric Durand, Techno-Feudalisme, maybe you heard about it. He's an economist, a French economist who wrote this book last year, Techno-Feudalisme, Critique de l'économie numérique. And some of your conclusions recoup, as I said, those of Durand, but and concerning the dominance of the GAFA and the possible transformation effect on capitalism by those actors, he was mentioning the question of antitrust regulation being, of course, totally ineffective to correct this rent economy, including this concept of hipster antitrust by Lina Khan that you heard about. I'm sure that was also a suggestion to correct the inefficiencies created, or the inequalities also created by this dominance of those actors. So at the end of the presentation, you put some not solution, but some point of reflection. I was thinking concerning especially the European policy. I read briefly on the Digital Service and Digital Market Act, but I also mainly remained the Bangemann report. Martin Bangemann, you remember him in the 90s, the end of the 90s, who issued a report that was detrimental to the industry in Europe and was maybe the cause of European lagging behind the American and the Chinese. I don't know if you remember, two main conclusions of this report was that the competition must be paramount, number one, and second, the state should never intervene in the market, as the American did, of course, and as they are doing now. So if antitrust is not a possibility, is maybe the idea of making those big actors public services a possibility? Public services, meaning by that like electricity, water, telecommunications, submitted to very heavy regulation, let's say. Would that be possible? Or what Cédric Durand, at the end of his book, who is quite pessimistic, I must say, is raising this idea of micro-resistance put forward by Michel Foucault in Naissance de la biopolitique, entre autres. So I was wondering, because of course we are lawyers here and we are jurists, and we always envisage this different problem by the regulation perspective. So I was wondering if there is any possibility that regulation could be a solution, and maybe this idea of making those big company public services.
Flo, you or me?
I can start with some generic comments, and perhaps you can dive in deeper. But I think the general paradox in this debate is that we have experienced that a lot in my work in the Commission on AI. We have a big fear of a takeover from the European perspective, or the realities that the big tech companies are very advanced. And we have a failure to respond in a qualitative way to the problem. I mean, of course, there is a big debate about the power of big tech in Europe. But when it comes to the question of how AI is to be promoted, the solutions that are taken are very similar, right? It's about startup financing, venture capital, and market-driven innovation processes, with the imagination that Europe should compete in a more effective way in a process of technological innovation that is considered to be linear, right? That it's just a matter of speed and who's first, and not about the qualitative content. And I think there is If you mentioned the Bangemann report, at the same time, there is a very strong change in perception, also pushed by COVID, that concerns the role of industrial policies. So we do have the acknowledgement that industrial policies matter. I think also that China brought home the point, if you want, that there is that there is some way of economic planning in high technology policies actually works and could be. I'm not a friend of the Chinese government, but could be implemented in a more democratic and more progressive context. But these convictions are not sufficiently translated into alternative policies that outlines a technological vision of Europe as an alternative form of an economy that pursues a transformation towards social and ecological aims. So there's a very one-dimensional thinking, in my perspective, driven by the race for AI and race around high technologies, which somehow links the political strategies to a model which obviously is not geared towards making technology work in order to make the world more just and sustainable. It's a very generic observation. In terms of the regulation policy, I'm sure Philipp has a lot more to say as his field of expertise.
No, I mean, the question is great. I'm not sure I can answer it in a sufficient way as I'm not a lawyer. But of course, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about that. And I have to say that, well, competition law as a single point approach, of course, won't solve much. Like this is basic digital economics, that when you break something up, then you have the network effects again, and so on, which would be one argument to make there. But I have to say, unfortunately, that I've become very, very pragmatic observing this whole issue for a couple of years now, and seeing that sort of everybody, like all the political agents, know where they want to end up at, but no one really dares to make any bold moves, which is of course mainly because of the Germans, right? Like everything you do against big tech companies means we sell maybe no cars anymore in the US, and this just blocks everything. Like Scholz, our finance ministry, he even blocked this really tiny piece of legislation, meaning the digital tax, because of that. So France and Austria had to do it on their own, and you lose all the weight of the EU. It's all such a pity, really. But on the other hand, I see that certain things sort of have started rolling, and I'm not sure if they can be stopped again. I'm also not sure where they might end up at. But one aspect that Florian mentioned, which is right, is the one of industrial politics, an issue that is coming back. And with Corona and the recovery fund, there is actually, for the first time, real money behind that. So this is an option, and it can be that it will all be messed up through the European way of administrating this money, and like this will ruin everything again, but let's see, right? And so this is one side. The other side is that aside from the very straight type of competition law, which is, again, the Germans are making the rules on the EU level there. What you have in the Digital Markets Act is basically the GWB-Novelle, the novellation of the German antitrust law, gone European. It's basically the same thing, and it's very much inspired by the German ordoliberal tradition. But then, using this, if you look at the Digital Markets Act, and of course we're looking at the first draft right now, and we do not know how much this will, be watered down with all the lobbying and all that stuff. But if you think of GDPR, there are examples where, not everything went bad, even though there was heavy lobbying from the tech industry. And within the Digital Markets Act, there is an aspect that I think could develop sort of not 100% intentionally, actually, into possibly a silver bullet. I'm trying to be very optimistic here. And this is the aspect of interoperability. So if you have strong legislation of interoperability within the Digital Markets Act, what could that mean? Thinking, for example, about e-commerce. It could mean that you take your phone, you open your Amazon app, you search for a product, and Amazon has to show you the offers from several, basically all the competing platforms that want to be there as well, from all the competing platforms, which then would create competition for those within those proprietary markets, between those proprietary markets, and drive the rents, the amount of money they can extract by selling access to customers, right, to consumers, which would possibly drive those rents downwards. This would be quite something, and it would be something that I would consider in the broader spectrum of European technopolitics to be on the part of, taming digital capitalism. This is one aspect. The other aspect is about, building up something else. And certain aspects within the political economy, they will not come from the digital issue. They will come from the Green Deal issue. Like if you think about border taxation for goods from outside Europe, this will come through the Green New Deal, through the greening of our steel production, which you then have to protect in order to be competitive. You have to have, I don't know the English term for it, Ausgleichszölle. You need some sort of border taxation in order that Chinese coal-made steel does not outcompete European green steel and so on. Yeah. And this will spread to other areas as well. So I think quite a lot of stuff is actually happening, and a lot of that looks to me that, and now you have to school me a little, because in my understanding, what the first option you laid out is what you discuss in the Anglosphere as, regulate as a utility, which I think as a type of legislation is not really there. It's not really there in the German law. I think it's not really there in European law, right? I'm not sure. But if you look at the policies attached to that stuff might actually sort of develop as an effect of several policies that I tried to lay out briefly as an effect. I'm not very optimistic, just to end my answer there. I'm not very optimistic about the aspects of micro-resistance. I mean, this discussion has been around for quite a while. You see that when it comes out of the public sector, like say mobility as a service platforms in European cities, where it is about strengthening the public transport system against Uber and such. This is always a market that Uber can enter. The platforms are run by private companies and only officially by public agents. This is all very, very much neoliberal. And when it comes from the sort of civic society, so to speak, side of things, they can only take the scraps of what big tech leaves for them. That's also my whole, like my main problem with open data policies in Europe, which, like, one thing is that they are there for the public sector. They're not there for the private companies, which is the first problem. And the second problem is that if you make the data public, Google and the likes are able to profit from that much, like, disproportionately more than any sort of civic society group or micro resistance agent. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have a few questions from the public. So I will read one of the first from Jean-Noël Berube. So the GAFAs and the wealth distribution model. From the wealth distribution model standpoint, the e-commerce giants, so the GAFAs, have managed to rack up hundreds of billions of dollars in tax shelters using the globalization of the world economy, as well as targeted and location-based digital commerce. Taking advantage of the national tax authorities' technological ignorance regarding this very specialized model of financing the sales of targeted advertising to the companies located into these countries. The question is, what can now do the tax authorities to broaden their taxation base, recover these unpaid taxes, and apply as soon as possible a better model of wealth distribution among the citizens residing into all those countries in this world? So basically the question.
I don't know, Flo, you, me?
You please. I think it's more to you.
No, I mean, this is a rather political argument because I cannot elaborate on the details of what a digital tax should actually look like. Like, this is just not my field of expertise. But generally speaking, as I already said, we are in the global economy, especially with Europe being sort of, when it comes to economic policies, with Germany being the driving force there. We are so entangled within global trade that everything we do which could shatter the remaining framework of global trade is just bad for the German production model, which is why it is very hard to get any real political power behind such strategies. I mean, with the digital tax, the German position was basically to delay it and delay it and delay it again. And this is the position from the possible chancellor from the left, you know? This is Olaf Scholz who did that, who is the leader of he's not the leader, but he's the chancellor candidate for the Social Democratic Party. And the only one who could probably lead a left coalition after Angela Merkel. And even him, you know, this is what someone who's not from Germany has to understand, is totally he cannot be counted on for sort of strong measures of that kind. And with digital taxes already being not a very strong measure, but I mean the next thing that would happen with that, which is always the German fear, is that, well, then Volkswagen all of a sudden will be taxed to a large degree in the US or China. And this is much worse for our tax base than it is for the American tax base if Google is partly taxed, you know, to what little degree ever in Europe.
Thank you. Florian, maybe you would like to add something?
No, but there was another question on blockchain.
Yeah. So how do you position Bitcoin and the cryptocurrencies in the context of this discussion?
Which is, I think the way to answer this is the following. So I think it has two components, right? The one is the role of blockchain in smoothening certain processes, especially in the logistics of goods, right? And there it plays a relevant role in automation processes, especially through smart contracts, which is linked a lot to the discussion of increasing the transparency of supply chains and the flexibility. It has also a huge, there's a huge rise of attention in the context of COVID and the whole debates about reshoring or increasing the resiliency of supply chains, where blockchain technologies are said to be basically to do things to improve the flexible adjustment of supply chains, and also to enable a better coordination of supply chains without disclosing sensitive data of the companies. At least that's a claim. In terms of automation and robotics in the narrow sense, I think it has a very limited issue, because the question we're facing is not a lack of capital, but it's a lack of productive investment opportunities. So the availability of cryptocurrencies, in my perspective, will not be a solution to the general problem I talked about in terms of return of investment in this trial and error process of automation experiments and the uphill battle that is connected to social innovation costs in that field. At least that's my take. I don't know if that completely answers the question. Certainly not. Blockchain and cryptocurrencies are a world by themselves, but I guess that has two components. One is how to apply blockchain in distributed manufacturing networks, and the second is blockchain or cryptocurrencies as a way of financing, where the impact should be rather limited.
I think that there is something very interesting here that could connect with both of your presentation. So first, the cryptocurrencies bear this idea that we can disconnect the money, for example, from states, and with this duality between the neoliberalism market and the more mercantile market that you've presented, Philipp, we can see that again we see a discharge of the state, and I'm guessing the companies behind those the development of the blockchain are very eager to go in that direction, and reduce again the potentiality for the state to intervene and to control the economy. And also, so that's on one hand maybe connected with the discussion with Philipp, and on the other side, I think your point on the ROI, return on investment, is very interesting, because here in Montreal we are very affected by the trendiness of artificial intelligence, and in particular with the deep learning. And we know that deep learning has been stressed out as a narrative. It was not presented that way, but some people decided to label it as the deep learning, and we know the success of this concept, and the very few concrete utilization in some markets. You know, we are talking a lot about the potentiality, but in some markets the return on investment are very small, such as in the market for automatization. And I think this is something interesting to recall all those narratives, and which at the end seems to be a way to capture some public funding for the investment in those companies. So again, I see like a way to capture public funding in a way, and in the other way, a way to administrate the economy without states. So maybe if you want to comment or.
Yeah, I mean, this is all very interesting. I think the way I see it, money is already disconnected from states. I mean, who governs and who governs the global money supply? It's private banks. Like all the money in Europe, if you look at the policies of the ECB, they will ensure with ECB money all the money any private bank has issued as credit, and they've been doing this for over 10 years, which means that effectively private banks drive the global money supply. And what happens with cryptocurrencies and blockchain in that regard is that those companies, like the old banks, like the leading companies of financial capitalism, so to speak, which collapsed in 2008 and then rebuilt quite well, they get new competition from certain, but they also sort of entangle with them, which is something with these new competitors, which is something you can see quite well in a recent example, which is the call of the Ant Financial IPO, which was basically the way I read it, because Ant is one of the main holders of consumer debt in China, which is just huge, right? And reminds you a lot about what was like the initial driving force of the crisis of 2008 in the US. But Ant doesn't really hold those debts. They distribute it to private Chinese banks, which means that the business model of Ant is actually a threat to the Chinese private bank financial system, which is, I think, one reason they called this off. And one idea which makes this issue a bit broader again, and relates it to the whole blockchain issue in a different way, is that blockchain was also, as a narrative, as you just described it for AI, seen as like many digital technologies before, as the next thing, again, decentralizing the digital economy. While what you see right now, if you look at, Flo said a few words about that already, another issue not mentioned yet is the fact that all the major developments within blockchain technology happen within two very large consortia, which are run by all the big tech companies, the first tier, the ones that we were talking about today, and the second tier companies like SAP, Salesforce, and so on, Oracle. And you already see that those companies are actually, sort of gaining a foothold or controlling this field already. And then to the question of how these narratives are used to capture public funding within, at least in Europe, a rather sclerotic type of capitalism. I mean, it's so mind-shattering sometimes. I have a colleague, you know her as well, Florian, Franziska Koyman, who's a researcher in Denmark and also at Weizmann Institute. She looks at European venture capital, and she sees that 2/3 of the venture capital investments made in Europe are done with public money. Mm-hmm. And the first thing we did in Germany, we have this, when we had the first lockdown roughly a year ago, like many things were rushed, and Germany was initially hyped for its quick crisis response, like in 2008, how well we were with Kurzarbeit and so on. And another thing they rushed, which was in the sort of, they had it in a box and they wanted to bring it out in autumn anyway, from the Ministry of Finance. They just like pulled it to half a year earlier. Is a scheme by which you try to boost the German or European startup economy by issuing a rather big sum of public venture capital through the KfW, which is sort of the institution that does that in Germany. Mm-hmm. It's a state-run bank basically, and what they did is, like, the deal they did is, this money will be used in a way that it matches private venture capital investment by European venture capitalists, whatever that is supposed to be, by 2/3. And no, by double. Like, they invest 500,000, the public hand gives 1 million on top. And the decision about the investments are exclusively made by the so-called European venture capitalists, which is just obscene. I mean, this is like, these are the paradox,
This is definitely a scheme.
Neoliberalism.
Yeah.
Maybe one comment connecting it to another question in the chat about the delay in regulation. I'm sure that this is a problem, that we have delay in regulation. Many of those realities we are facing, then yet unknown, and there is some substance behind it. But the main problem is the one Philipp just talked about, that we have a conscious political stance, which means let them do first and later we regulate, right? And we had, if you want, one round of these processes around the commercial internet, and now in AI, it's continuing just the same, that the dominant discourse in European governments is, or not the dominant discourse, that's too far, but it's the attitude is that first we need to create a dynamic that is mostly created by venture capital and by startups, and later we see how we can react upon this. At least that's what comes from strong voices inside the political field, and this way you create the delay in regulation yourself unconsciously. I think that's a major problem we're facing, instead of asking how we proactively shape the process from the very beginning and have a greater public role in this development.
And I think this is all very associated with the question of Mr. Ouattara, because the concept of a sandbox and sandboxing, like testing some algorithm for finance, or sandboxing the blockchain for project, is definitely this idea. Like, we will let the venture capitalists decide what could be the opportunity associated with the technology, and then when it's too late, we will regulate and accompany the movement. So there is also a last question that is quite interesting here, is regarding the rent extraction. So the topic discussed by Philipp. Why not more attention to workers' rights?
Yeah, I'm asking myself the same question.
Yeah.
No, I mean, this is again, I really hate to end things on like very pessimistic notes, because as a sociologist, this is maybe something I can sort of maybe not surprise you with, but sort of lay out for you as experts in law. Other than what I perceive law as, but maybe that's a wrong perception. But say that the way I perceive political science when it advises on policy making is, you create a policy, say legislation, you draw out the effects it will have before, and then it will have these effects. This is just like a very, very unsociological type of thinking. Sociology is the science of unintended consequences. So basically what I'm hoping for is that we started so many things on so many different levels in Europe now, with the digital services package, with the competition law initiatives, with the new industrial policy, with the Green Deal, with the recovery fund, with Germany being in the post-Merkel era already, and definitely being in the post-Merkel era after September, because she will not run again. She's not running again. That something, you know, like out of all the conflicts within this policy framework, which we did not talk at all about today, but which would be a whole presentation as well, you know, frictions within the regulatory and investive approaches that are there. I'm not really pessimistic about things that might happen, and it is up to this point rather astonishing. I mean, there is an empirical answer to the question why there's not a stronger focus on workers' rights. And again, it has something to do with Germany, which is basically, Flo said that a couple of times, Industry 4.0 is sort of the very German idea about digital capitalism, must have something to do with car making, must have something to do with industrial production. And well, if you look at the core industries in Germany, roughly, they are only roughly 20% of the labor force. But these 20%, they live in a highly institutionalized and regulated environment, which benefits labor highly. And the German trade unions, especially the IG Metall, which is the strongest and biggest non-state union in the world, definitely the mightiest real union in the world. They have done very, very smart politics after, and like in terms of globalization, in terms of the crisis of 2008. And again, right now, safeguarding workers' rights, but only for those 20%, right? Which in most other European countries do not exist to this extent. But then again, Flo, what is the number? It's always 2/3 of the labor force in Germany are sort of service workers, and only a little less than a third is in those core industries. But 2/3 of the value created in Germany and distributed through taxes, the welfare state, and so on in Germany are based on industrial production. This sort of explains this overemphasis of this part of the economy, which for most German workers is not the area they work in or live in. The rights, they do not have these rights really in reality, but this is what shapes the whole debate. And yeah, so in a way, the strength of the last remaining really strong industrial union in the West is the reason why we do not talk about stronger workers' rights in Germany, which is shaping to a large degree the debate in Europe. That's the way I would frame it. How do you see that, Flo?
I would just put in, I really like your optimistic outlook about the current conjuncture, which is a really good bottom line to this. And I mean, we also already mentioned it, but I just would put in or add the two ingredients that are obvious at the moment. That is the relevance of industrial policies after COVID. So there is definitely a shift and new potentials in this sense, or at least a new awareness of the necessity to design the post-COVID order. And the second is the ecological crisis, which is beyond something that is just looming in the background, but getting more and more political relevance. And I mean, Nothing of this means that we have a leap in the ability to regulate these processes we talked about, and rent extraction and digital capitalism. But this is, at least, it's an exciting landscape full of tensions where progressive alternatives might emerge from. You know, I think that's a possible takeaway. I mean, that's a hope, and maybe also a narrative in a way. We started off with criticizing the narratives, but there's a lot to it. That at least what we can sure of is that we will not, well, come back to a complacent and quiet state of normality that we've seen in the past couple of years.
I think we have a very great conclusive quote here, with a more positive view from Philipp, and an interesting view from Florian. So I will warmly thank you for your intervention today. It was, I think, very, very interesting. And I would be pleased to continue this conversation. And please send us some info concerning potential articles, or the information concerning your new book, Philipp, when it will be translated in English. And I invite, and I also thank all the people that participated.